The last night I worked there, I walked the whole second-floor exterior at 4 in the morning, and every single door had a deadbolt thrown on the outside, a bolt where no bolt should be, on the wrong face of the door, locking 16 rooms shut from the walkway. And I stood there in the desert cold with my ring of keys in my hand, and understood, finally and all at once, that the locks weren't there to keep anyone out of those rooms. They were there to keep something in, and that whatever it was, we'd been the ones checking it in, one vacancy at a time, all summer. You have to understand what a night engineer at a place like that actually is, because the title's fancier than the job. I was the guy who fixed things after midnight. Busted AC in 214, no hot water in the block, a toilet backing up, a card reader gone dead, a drunk who'd put his fist through a mirror. One man, one radio, one golf cart, one ring of masters, a 2-story horseshoe motel with 112 rooms, wrapped around a parking lot and a drained pool. 3 blocks off the strip, on a street the tourists never walk down on purpose. From 11 at night till 7 in the morning, the building was mine. The front desk had 1 clerk. Housekeeping was gone by 10. And everything that broke in the dark broke for me. My name is Cassius Vane, and I worked the night at the Desert Coronet Motor Inn for the better part of a year before it closed. And I've never told this to anybody who wasn't paid to listen to me. And the ones who were paid to listen wrote down words like stress and hypervigilance and sleep deprivation. And maybe they were right. And I've spent a long time hoping they were right. Because the other thing that would explain it is worse. I'm going to lay it out straight, in the order it came, and you can put whatever word on it you want at the end. Let me start with the board, because that's where it started. And it started so quiet, I didn't clock it for weeks. Behind the front desk, there was an old occupancy board, not the computer. The computer ran the actual bookings. But there was this old wooden board on the back wall, a leftover from the 60s when the place was somebody's pride. A grid of little brass hooks, 1 hook for every room, and a room key or a tag on the hook if the room was empty, and a bare hook if the room was occupied and the key was out with the guest. Nobody used it for real anymore. The night clerk kept it up out of habit, the way you keep a thing your predecessor kept, moving the tags around to match the computer. Because the old owner liked to be able to glance at the wall and see his house at a glance. The Coronet ran maybe 40–50% full most of that summer. Cheap rooms, weekly rates, a lot of long-stay people folks working the strip service jobs, folks between things, folks who'd washed up in Vegas and not washed back out. On any given night, half those brass hooks had a tag on them. Half the house was empty. That's normal for a place like that. That's the business. The first thing that went wrong was the board filling up. I noticed it because of the card readers. Part of my night was walking the property and hitting the low battery card locks with a programmer. And to do that efficiently, I'd glance at the board first to see which rooms were empty, so I wasn't knocking on a sleeping guest's door at 2 a.m. And one night, in early June, I looked at the board, and there were maybe 6 tags on it. 6 empty rooms out of 112. And I thought, big night, we're packed. And I went and asked the clerk, a tired kid named Delgado, who worked the desk, how he got so full on a Tuesday. And Delgado looked at the computer and said, "We're not full. We're at 41%. 60-some rooms empty. 60-some empty rooms. 6 tags on the board. Board's just not updated," Delgado said, and shrugged. And I let it go, because that's the obvious answer. Somebody didn't move the tags. The board's decorative. Who cares? But I'm an engineer. I like a system to agree with itself. So the next night, slow night, I updated the whole board myself against the computer. Pulled every tag, checked the computer room by room, Hung a tag on every empty room. 64 tags. Got it perfect. Board matched the computer, hook for hook. I felt that little satisfaction you feel when you square a thing away, and I went out on my rounds. I came back in at 4 a.m. for coffee, and there were 11 tags on the board. 53 tags gone. 53 empty rooms turned occupied on a board nobody had touched. On a night the computer still said we were at 41%. On a night when Delgado had checked in exactly 0 new guests because I'd have heard the door chime from the coffee station. 53 bare hooks where I'd hung tags myself 3 hours before. I stood there and I counted them twice. And then I did the thing you do, the thing I'd keep doing all summer, which is I built a reason. The tags fell off. Cheap old brass hooks, the tags slid off. They're on the floor. I got down and looked on the floor behind the desk. No tags. I checked the drawer. No tags. 53 room tags, gone, and 53 hooks bare, meaning 53 empty rooms now reading as occupied on a board that couldn't book a room and hadn't been touched. And I told myself Delgado did it, messing with me, the night shift boredom prank. And I didn't ask him, because if I asked him and he said he hadn't, then I'd have to keep looking at it. And I didn't want to keep looking at it. So I said nothing. And that was the first thing I swallowed. And I've learned since that the first thing you swallow is the one that costs you later, because by the time the price comes due, you've forgotten you agreed to pay it. I need to tell you about the coronet itself, because the building is half of this, maybe more than half. It was old, built in '61, back when a motor court 3 blocks off Fremont was a fine place to be. And it had been fine for a while, and then it had been not fine for 60 years, and it wore all 60 of them. 2 stories, exterior walkways, the horseshoe wrapped around a parking lot, and a swimming pool that had been drained and fenced since before I started. A rectangle of cracked blue concrete with a diving board over nothing. The kind of place that had a name in cursive neon out front, half the letters dead. DESRTCROET, buzzing. It had an occupancy problem that wasn't the board. It had a feeling problem. There were rooms in that building that didn't rent right. The desk knew it. Housekeeping knew it. Everybody who worked there knew it, without anybody writing it down. There was a block on the far side of the second floor, the shadow side, rooms 240 through 256, that we called the back rooms. And they went last, always. And people who took them tended to check out early, and housekeeping went into them in pairs. Nobody said why. It was just the way the building was, the way an old house has a cold room. And you learn it, and you work around it. And you don't think about it too hard, because thinking about it too hard is not part of the job. The owner, I never met a management company, ran it remote. A name on the paychecks. The general manager, a woman named Odalis Fenn, worked days, and I saw her maybe twice a month at shift change. And the night clerk was Delgado. And there was a security guy, an old fellow named Pruitt, who was supposed to patrol but mostly slept in the office with a scanner on. And that was the whole night crew. Delgado at the desk, Pruitt asleep, and me on the property with the keys. 3 of us, and 112 rooms, and a board that filled itself up in the dark. I didn't tell any of them about the board. Not Delgado, because I'd half decided he was doing it. Not Pruitt, who slept. Not Odalis, who I barely saw. I told myself it wasn't worth the conversation. That was true. It wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that saying a thing out loud is what makes you responsible for it. And I did not want to be the night engineer who told the GM the magic board was haunted. So I kept my mouth shut. And the gap between what I knew and what I said got a little wider every night. And a man can live in that gap a long time before he notices it's become the whole of where he lives. The second thing that went wrong was the water. And it's what made me stop being able to call it the board. You track water at a place like the Coronet. Old plumbing, you watch the usage, you catch a running toilet or a slab leak before it becomes a flood. There was a meter and a log, and part of my night was reading it. And that summer, the water usage started climbing. Not a leak climb. I know a leak. A leak is steady. A leak runs all night at a constant rate. This was different. This spiked. Between 2 and 4 in the morning, every night, the usage jumped like the whole house was awake and running showers. And then it dropped back to nothing. Dozens of rooms worth of water, moving through the pipes in the dead middle of the night, in a building that was 60% empty. I chased it. First, I thought it was the same running toilet answer, and I went looking for the running toilets. And here's the thing that turned my stomach the first time, and turns it still. I'd stand at the meter at 3 a.m. and watch it spinning, water pouring through the system, and I'd trace it up to the second-floor manifold, and the water was going to the back rooms. 240 through 256. The shadow side. The rooms that were empty on the computer and vacant on housekeeping's list and occupied on the board that filled itself. I put my ear to the door of 248 one night. 3:15 in the morning, the meter spinning downstairs, and I heard a shower running inside. Full blast. And I heard something else under it, and I've never been able to decide what. And I've decided not to try in front of you because I don't want to build it up into more than it was. I'll just say, I heard a shower running full blast inside a room that was empty on every list we kept. And I heard, under the water, the specific small sounds of a person in a bathroom in the middle of the night. The shift of weight, the squeak of a hand on wet tile, the sounds you make when you're in a shower and you don't know anyone's listening at the door. I had the master. I could have opened it. I want you to know I stood there with the key an inch from the lock. And I did not open the door of room 248. And I've asked myself 1,000 times whether that made me a coward, or whether it's the only reason I'm here to tell this. And the honest answer is, I don't know. And I've stopped pretending I do. I went back downstairs. The meter had stopped. The water was off. I logged the usage the way I logged everything, and I did not write down that I'd heard a shower in an empty room, because writing it down makes it real. And I made a note in my own head that I'd been up too many nights. And I went home at 7 and slept badly. And that was the second thing I swallowed. And it was bigger than the first, and it went down harder. I have to tell you about the check-in chime, because that's the third thing. And it's the one that made a shape out of the other two. The front door of the office had a chime, an old electric 2-note bing-bong wired to the door, so the clerk knew when someone came in off the lot. All night, every time the door opened, bing-bong. You stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a clock, but it was wired to a little counter, an old mechanical tally the original owner had put in to count foot traffic. And it sat on the wall behind the desk, clicking over. And nobody looked at it. It was just there, a relic, counting. I started looking at it because of the board and the water, because I'd gotten it into my head that something was checking in. And if something was checking in, the door had to open. And if the door opened, the chime counted it. So one night, I zeroed the counter at 11 when I came on. And I told Delgado to keep track of every real guest who came through the door, actual people. Checking in, buying a room. Human beings he handed a key to. And I told him it was for a foot traffic study the management company wanted, which was a lie. And he believed it because it was boring enough to be true. At 7 in the morning, I read the counter. 209. 209 times that door had opened in the night. Delgado's count of actual human guests through the door. 9. 9 people came into that office all night. The door opened 200 times more than that. And I'd been at the desk or near it most of the night, and I had not seen the door open 200 times, had not seen 200 people, had heard the chime. Sure, all night, bing bong, bing bong, the way you hear it and don't hear it, but not 200 times. Not that I'd have sworn to. And then I understood. Standing there at 7 a.m. with the counter reading 209 and the board reading nearly full, and the water log showing dozens of rooms worth of showers in an empty house, I understood the shape of what I'd been not looking at all summer. Something was checking in. All night, every night, coming through the door, taking the empty rooms, filling the board, running the water in the dead hours. The building wasn't 60% empty. The computer thought it was. The people who paid us thought it was. But the coronet wasn't empty. The coronet was filling up. It had been filling up all summer, room by room, vacancy by vacancy. And the only record of it was an old brass board and a mechanical counter and a water meter that nobody but the night engineer ever read. The building was doing what a motel does. It was filling its vacancies. That's the only thing a motel ever wants. No empty rooms, a full house. The neon reading, no vacancy. It's the whole purpose of the thing. And the coronet had been half empty for 60 years. A dying box on a bad street. And somewhere in that summer it had started, on its own, in the dark, to fill itself, to check something in, to make itself full. And it needed a night engineer to keep the mechanicals running for a full house, the water, the power, the AC, the locks, because a full house needs tending. And I'd been tending it all summer, keeping the systems up for guests I'd been telling myself weren't there. I want to be honest about Delgado, because this is the part where I could have said something and didn't. And I've come to believe that not saying is the real sin in this whole account. More than the doors, more than anything I found. Because once I understood the shape of it, I understood something about the risk of it. And the risk wasn't mine. I stayed out on the property, on the golf cart, moving, my hands on the mechanicals, keeping the house running. A night engineer is a working part of the building, not a guest. But Delgado sat at the desk all night, behind the counter, in one place, the still point the whole filling house turned around, handing keys to the 9 humans, and, I had started to think, to the 200 that weren't. Delgado was the one checking them in. Delgado was the desk. And a filling motel needs a clerk more than it needs anything. Needs someone at the desk to take the reservation, to make the check-in real, to hang the room on the board. I could have told him, "Kid, something's wrong. The board fills itself. The water runs in empty rooms. The counter reads 200. Get another job. Don't sit that desk alone in the dead hours. I don't like what the building does around you." I could have said any of that. Instead, I told myself a story. And I'm going to lay it out because the shape of it is the shape of what I am. I told myself he wouldn't believe me true, and a coward's true. I told myself I had no proof, but a counter and a board that anybody could call a glitch true, and a coward's true. And underneath, down where I made myself not look until much later, I told myself that as long as Delgado was the still point, the desk, the one the filling house turned around, then it was busy with him, and it left me alone out on the property with my keys and my cart. Moving, useful, unnoticed. I told myself, without ever quite saying the words, that better the building fixate on the man at the desk than on the man with the master keys, because the man with the master keys was me. That's the whole of it. And I said nothing. and I kept my rounds, and I kept the house running for a full board and a spinning meter. And I let Delgado sit that desk alone in the dead hours all through July, checking in whatever came through the door 200 times a night, because as long as it wanted him, it didn't want me. And then one night in early August, at 3:40 in the morning, with the water meters spinning downstairs and the board reading no vacancy for the first time all summer, every hook bare, every room full. I came in off the cart for coffee, and the front door chimed behind me, bing bong, and I turned to say something to Delgado, and the chair at the desk was empty. His radio was on the counter. His phone was on the counter, screen still lit. His key drawer was open. And on the board, on the back wall, one tag had appeared where no tag had been all night. Hung on a single hook, a room turned suddenly, impossibly vacant in a house that had just filled all the way up. One empty room in a full motel. One open vacancy, as if the house had checked one thing out to make room to check one thing in. The tag was on the hook for the desk clerk's own room. Delgado lived on property in a staff room, room 112, first floor. And that room had read occupied all summer because he lived in it. And now its tag hung bare and vacant on the board, while every guest room read full. And Delgado's chair was empty, and his phone was lit, and the front door was still swinging from a chime I'd heard as I walked in. And I stood there in the office at 3:40 in the morning and understood that the house had made room. And I knew which door I had to go to. And I knew it was going to be locked from the outside. And I have to stop the first part of this here, because what I found when I walked out to that walkway is the part I've never told a soul. And I need to get it exactly right. I went out to room 112 the long way, and I want to tell you why. Because it matters to what kind of man I was that night. The short way was straight out the office door and around the corner of the horseshoe, 40 feet, 10 seconds. I didn't go the short way. I went the long way, all the way around the far side of the property on the golf cart. And I told myself it was because I needed to check the second floor water manifold on the way. And that was a lie. And I knew it was a lie even as I drove it. I went the long way because every step toward Delgado's door was a step I didn't want to take. And a man will invent a whole route through a building to keep from arriving somewhere he's afraid to arrive. So I drove the far side first, the shadow side, the back rooms, 240 through 256. And that's how I know what I know about the water. Because as I passed them on the upper walkway, the sound came through every door at once. Showers, all of them. Full blast, 3:40 in the morning, 16 empty rooms, running water hard enough that I could feel the warmth of it coming off the doors. A wet heat in the desert cold air. And under the water, that same small human shifting I'd heard at 248 in June. Except now, it was 16 rooms of it. 16 rooms of somebody in the shower who didn't know anyone was listening. And I did not stop, and I did not put my ear to any door, and I did not slow the cart. I drove past all 16 with my eyes forward and my jaw locked. And the meter, I knew, was spinning downstairs, feeding a full house. And every door on that walkway had a deadbolt thrown on the outside. I didn't register it right that first pass, because it's the kind of thing your eye slides off. A bolt on the outside of a door reads as normal for half a second before the wrongness lands. These weren't the card locks. These were old brass deadbolts, the kind you'd throw from inside a room for privacy, except they were mounted on the outside of the doors, on the walkway face, and they were thrown, every one. 16 rooms bolted shut from the outside, while 16 showers ran inside. I'd walked that walkway 1,000 times. There had never been an outside bolt on any door in that building. And now there were 16 on the shadow side, on the full rooms. and I drove past them telling myself I'd look closer later, which was the same lie as the long way, a lie to buy 10 more seconds of not knowing. I came around the horseshoe to the first floor, and I parked the cart at 112, and I got off, and there it was, Delgado's door, room 112. And on the outside of it, where there had never been one, where I'd fixed the card lock on that exact door in April, and there was no deadbolt at all, there was now a brass deadbolt, mounted on the outside, and it was thrown, and behind the door, I could hear the shower running. Here's the thing I have to make you understand about the bolts, because it's the whole rule of the house, and it took me the rest of that night to see it. A motel exists to fill its rooms. That's it. That's the entire nature of the thing. An empty room is a wound to a motel, a failure, a vacancy sign burning in the dark. And the coronet had been 60% wounded for 60 years. A half-dead box that could not fill itself the honest way, because the street had died and the tourists didn't come, and the only guests it got were the washed up and the passing through. So it had learned to fill itself the other way. It checked things in. All summer, 200 a night, coming through the door, taking the vacancies, running the water, filling the board, and every room it filled it bolted from the outside, because a guest a motel gets that way is not a guest that can be allowed to check out. A vacancy, once filled, has to stay filled. That's the rule. The house doesn't want visitors. It wants occupancy. Permanent, bolted, full occupancy. No vacancy forever. Every room accounted for. And none of them ever emptying again. And the water, I understood the water then too, standing at Delgado's bolted door. The showers weren't the guests washing. The showers were the rooms keeping their guests. You run water in an old building. You keep the pipes warm. You keep the room lived in. You keep the walls from going cold and dry and empty feeling. The house was running the showers to make the filled rooms feel occupied, to keep them occupied. The way you leave a light on and a radio playing in a house you don't want to seem empty. The water was the house tending its full rooms, keeping them warm and wet and lived in, so that whatever it had checked into them would stay, would settle, would become permanent occupancy instead of a vacancy waiting to happen. And a full house needs a night engineer. That's why it kept me. I thought I was tending guests I told myself weren't there. I was. I was keeping the water running and the power up and the AC cold and the locks working for a house filling itself with permanent occupants. And every night I did my rounds, I was helping it. I was staff, and staff, the house had decided, was different from a guest. Staff keeps the building running. Staff is a working part of the machine. Staff doesn't get bolted in. As long as I was useful, as long as I kept the systems up for the full house, the house needed me on the outside of the doors, not the inside. But Delgado wasn't like me. Delgado was the desk. And here's the thing I finally saw, the thing that made me sick, standing at his bolted door. The desk clerk is the one who checks people in. And the house had been checking things in all summer through Delgado, using him, the man at the desk, the still point, to make its occupancy real, because a motel can't just have things appear in rooms. That's not occupancy, that's infestation. For it to be occupancy, for it to count, for the board to fill right, there has to be a check-in, a clerk, a key handed over. And Delgado had been sitting that desk all summer, handing keys to the 200, whether he knew it or not, making the house's filling official room by room. And once the house was full, once every room was checked in and bolted, no vacancy, the board Barrett didn't need a clerk anymore. A full house doesn't check anyone in. There's no one left to check in. The desk clerk becomes the one thing a full motel has no use for. An empty function, a vacancy in the staff. And the house does what it does with a vacancy. It filled it. It had checked Delgado in. It had made one last vacancy on the board, his own staff room, 112. And it had checked him into it, and bolted the door from the outside, and turned on the shower. And now the coronet was full, all the way full, staff and guests both. Every room occupied and bolted and warm and running water. 111 permanent occupants and a night engineer still driving his cart around the outside because he was still useful, still keeping it all running, still, God help me, staff. I had the master. I stood at 112 with the shower running behind it and the outside bolt thrown. And I had the key that opened every door in the building on my ring. And I put my hand on that bolt. And I want to tell you exactly what happened when I touched it, because it's the closest I ever came to the truth of the thing. The bolt was warm, not room warm. Warm like a hand, like something that had just been held, and the moment my fingers closed on it, the shower behind the door stopped instantly, mid-flow, cut off, and the silence behind that door was the loudest thing I have ever heard. And then in the silence, from inside room 112, right on the other side of the door, 6 inches from my face, I heard Delgado's voice. He said, "Cassius, hey, door's stuck. Can you let me in?" Let me in, not out, in. And it was his voice, exactly his voice. Tired and a little bored and ordinary, the voice he used on the radio all night. "Can you take a look at the ice machine on 2? That voice. And it was coming from inside the bolted room. And it said, "Let me in." And every part of me that had worked alongside that kid for a year, that liked him, that felt sick about leaving him at that desk. Every decent part of me wanted to throw that bolt and open that door and let him in, out, whatever. Just open it. Just get him. And the part of me that had been a night engineer for 20 years, the part that reads a system and knows when a system is lying, that part heard, let me in, and went cold all the way down. Because Delgado was already in. He was on the other side of the bolted door. You don't ask to be let into the room you're already inside, unless the thing asking wasn't inside the room, unless the thing asking was the room, unless the house had learned Delgado's voice, the way it had learned everything else about being full, and was using it at my ear to get me to do the one thing that would make me not staff anymore. The one thing that would turn me from the useful engineer into the last vacancy, open the door. Because if I opened that door, if I threw the bolt and stepped in to get him, I'd have gone from the man who keeps the house running to a man entering a room. A guest, crossing the threshold into the occupancy, into the one open door in a full house. And a full house bolts its doors from the outside, and there'd have been no one left outside to keep me from being bolted in, because I was the last one outside. I was the whole night crew that was left, me and old Pruitt asleep in the office with his scanner. And Pruitt didn't have the masters. Pruitt couldn't get me out. Nobody could get me out, because getting people out was never what those bolts were for. I did not throw the bolt. I stood at room 112 with Delgado's voice saying, "Cassius, come on, man. Let me in. It's cold." And I did not open the door. And I backed away from it. 1 step, 2. And the voice changed, not louder, worse. It went reasonable. It went hurt. It said, "Cassius, don't leave me in here, please. You left me at that desk all summer. You knew. You knew, and you let me sit there so it'd take me instead of you. Don't leave me in here too." And that was true. Every word of it was true. And the house knew it was true. And it used the truth on me the way it used the voice. Because the truth was the sharpest tool it had. And I stood in the parking lot of the Desert Coronet at 4 in the morning and heard my own worst sin read back to me in the voice of the man I'd sinned against, from behind a door I could open and would not. And I have never once been able to decide whether not opening it saved my life or whether I abandoned Delgado a second time and told myself it was already too late because I could not carry having done it twice. Both are true. I'm not going to dress that up. I left him at the desk to keep the house off me. And then I stood at his bolted door and left him again. Both times I chose myself. The only thing I can say for the second time is that opening the door wouldn't have saved him. He was already checked in, already occupancy, already permanent. It would only have made me the next vacancy the house filled. But I don't get to know that for certain. I only get to tell myself that, on the bad nights, to get to the morning, I did not run. I want that on the record for whatever it's worth, which isn't much. I could have driven the cart to the gate and walked off the property and never come back, and part of me screamed too. But I was still staff, and some cold, clear engineer part of me understood that as long as I was staff, as long as I kept moving and kept the systems running and did not cross a threshold, the house had no use for me except to keep it full. And a thing that needs you doesn't fill your vacancy. So I did the most terrible thing I've ever done, which was I finished my shift. I got back on the cart, and I drove my rounds, and I read the meter, and I logged the water, and I hit the low card locks with the programmer, and I did my whole night, past every bolted door, past every running shower, past 112 where a voice that sounded like Delgado's went from pleading to weeping to final of a sunny. Quiet, the same quiet as all the other full rooms, the settled quiet of permanent occupancy, and I kept the house running for it, because the running was the only thing keeping me on the outside of the doors. I have thought a great deal about what it means that the thing that saved me was continuing to serve the thing that took him. I don't have a clean answer. I did my job. My job was keeping a haunted house full and warm and running. I did it well. That's the worst sentence in this whole account, and I'm going to leave it standing. At 7 a.m., the day crew came on, and the light came up over the desert. And I want to tell you what the morning did, because it's the cruelest part. In the daylight, the bolts were gone. I walked the property at shift change with Odalis Fenn, the GM, and every outside deadbolt was gone. No holes, no marks, the doors ordinary. The board behind the desk read 41%, tags on 60-some hooks, a half-empty motel on a Tuesday morning. The water meter read normal overnight usage, the chime counter read 9. And Delgado wasn't at the desk, and his room, 112, was empty, genuinely empty. In the daylight, his things gone, his bed stripped, checked out, and Odalis looked at the empty staff room and sighed and said, he didn't even give notice. They never do. You get a night clerk to last 3 months in this place, you're lucky. And she wrote him up as a walk-off, a no-notice quit, the way a dozen night clerks before him had walked off. And she posted the job again that afternoon. And I stood in the daylight in the empty, half-full, ordinary motel and understood the last piece of it. The house only fills in the dark. In the daylight, it lets go, sinks back, becomes a half-dead box on a bad street with a decorative board and old plumbing and a high turnover of night staff who walk off without notice. Because it's patient, it doesn't need to hold its fullness in the day. It only needs the nights, and it has all the nights there are. And nobody who works days will ever see it, and nobody who works nights lasts long enough to see the shape of it, because it either takes them or drives them off. And either way, the desk is empty by morning, and the job gets posted again. And some new washed-up soul takes it because a job is a job in a town that eats people, and the whole thing starts over. I almost walked off myself that morning. I nearly became exactly what Delgado became on paper, a night engineer who quit without notice, a name in the turnover, A vacancy the house would post and fill by the weekend. And here is the thing I have to confess, because it's the reason there's a part 3, and the reason I'm telling this at all, instead of taking it into the ground. I didn't walk off. And it wasn't because I was brave. It was because, standing there in the daylight with Delgado written up as a walk-off, I understood that if I walked off, the house would post my job, and some new engineer would take it, and it would use him the way it used me, and he'd keep the systems running for a filling house until it decided he was more useful checked in than employed. And then it would take him too, and post the job again, forever, one night engineer at a time, the same as the desk, the same as the guests. And I understood that I was the only person alive who knew that. Odalis didn't know. The management company didn't know. Prewitt slept through it. Delgado knew for one night, and then became it. I was the only one who'd stood at a bolted door and heard the house speak in a stolen voice and not opened it. The only one who'd seen the whole shape and lived to carry it. And if I walked off, I'd be handing the next engineer to the house the exact way I'd handed it Delgado by knowing. And saying nothing. And choosing myself. I'd done that once. I'd stood in the office in June with a board that filled itself, and I'd said nothing. And Delgado paid for my silence. I was not going to do it again. Not because I'd become good. Because I could not stand to be the man who does it twice, and then a third time, and then hands the doing of it down to whoever came after me, the way it had been handed to me. So I didn't walk off. I stayed. I stayed at the Desert Coronet Motor Inn, working nights, keeping a haunted house full and running, because I decided I was going to be the last night engineer that place ever had. And that's where the second part of this has to end. On a bright, ordinary desert morning, with Delgado's job already posted, and my own resignation letter half written in my pocket and torn up again. Because the third part is the part where I figured out what a man actually does about a building that fills its own vacancies, and what it cost. And it's the only part of this I'm not ashamed of. And I need to tell it slow and get it exactly right. I stayed at the Desert Coronet for 11 more weeks, and I want to tell you how I spent them, because it wasn't bravery and it wasn't a plan, not at first. At first, it was just a man going to work every night at a place he was afraid of, because he decided he couldn't leave, and he didn't yet know why or what leaving without leaving was supposed to look like. I'd come on at 11, and I'd do my rounds, and I'd read the meter and log the water and hit the card locks. And all night, I'd feel the house filling around me in the dark. The board going bare, hook by hook. The showers coming on in the empty rooms, the chime counting up past 200. And I'd keep the systems running for all of it. Staff, useful, on the outside of the doors. And I'd go home at 7 and sleep badly and come back and do it again. The new desk clerk lasted 9 days. A woman this time, older, named Sunny. And I want that on the record, I tried to tell her. My second night working with her, tried to say something about the board and the water and the nights. And she looked at me the way you look at a man who's been on the graveyard shift too long. Kind, but done listening. And she said, "Honey, I've worked worse than this. Vegas is full of buildings that give you the creeps." And she went back to her phone. And I understood I couldn't save her by warning her. The same as I couldn't have saved Delgado. Because the house doesn't take you through the front of your mind where a warning lands. It takes you through the boredom and the tiredness and the ordinary. And on her 9th night, I came in for coffee at 3:40. And her chair was empty and her phone was lit on the counter. And one tag hung bare on the board where no tag had been. And I did not go out to whatever room the house had made vacant for her. Because I already knew what I'd find at the door. And I already knew I wouldn't open it. And I hate that I'd learned that. I hate that by the second one I didn't even go and stand at the door and hear the voice, I just logged the water and finished my shift. And Odalis wrote Sunny up as a walk-off in the morning and posted the job again. 2 clerks in 11 weeks. That's what finally moved me from staying to acting. Because I understood, watching Sunny's job go back up on the board, that staying wasn't enough. Me not walking off didn't stop the house. The house didn't need me to walk off. It had the desk. It would eat clerk after clerk through that desk forever. And me staying and keeping the systems running was just, I made myself see it plain, me keeping the house alive so it could keep eating. I wasn't the last night engineer holding the line. I was the maintenance man on a machine that fed on the people it hired. Staying, if all I did was stay, made me part of it. Made me the thing that kept it running, so it could stay full. So I stopped asking how to leave without feeding the next one. And I started asking the only question that mattered. Which was the question no engineer had ever asked about that building in 60 years. How do you empty it? Here's how I worked it out. And it wasn't a vision, and nobody told me. It came out of 20 years of knowing how buildings work, which turned out to be the only qualification that mattered. A motel's whole nature is to be full. An empty room is a wound to it. No vacancy is its heart's desire. So the coronet, dying and half-empty for 60 years, had learned to fill itself in the dark. And once it started, it could not stop. Because stopping meant vacancy. And vacancy was the one thing it could not bear. It filled and bolted every room permanent so nothing would ever check out. Because a checkout is a vacancy. And it would rather take its own staff than allow a vacancy. That was the engine. That was the sickness. It could not tolerate an empty room. Which meant the way to kill it was not to fight the fullness. You can't fight a thing that turns everyone who enters a room into occupancy. The way to kill it was the opposite. The way to kill it was to make it empty, really empty, all the way empty. 112 rooms empty at once. 0 occupancy, every room vacant. The one thing it had spent 60 years and God knows how many night clerks making sure could never happen. Not fight the fullness, force the vacancy, check everyone out, all of them, at once. Empty the whole house down to nothing and hold it empty, past the dark, into the daylight, until the wound of total vacancy was more than the thing could survive. Because a motel that cannot bear an empty room cannot bear 112 empty rooms. And a thing whose entire nature is occupancy, forced into total vacancy, has nothing left to be. But you can't just unbolt the doors, I knew that. The bolts weren't the occupancy. They were just how it kept the occupancy. And you can't check out a guest that isn't a person anymore. That's become the room. That's become permanent. There's no checkout for that. Unless you're the desk. Because that was the other half of it. The half that made it possible and made it cost what it cost. The house made its occupancy real through the desk. It couldn't just have things appear in rooms. That's infestation. That's not occupancy. That doesn't fill the board, right? For it to count, for the board to fill, for the fullness to be real enough to satisfy the thing, there had to be a check-in, a clerk, a key handed over across the counter. That's why it needed the desk clerk. That's why it ate them. One after another, it needed a human being at the desk to make the check-ins official, to sign the occupancy into being. And it burned through them because being the desk in that house was fatal. But it needed the desk. It could not fill itself without someone signing the register. And a register that can be signed to fill can be signed to empty. If the check-in was what made the occupancy real, then the checkout a real one, made by a real clerk at the real desk, hand on the register, key taken back across the counter that would make the vacancy real. Every room I could check out from that desk would become truly empty. Not just unbolted, but vacant, checked out, wound open. And if I could check out all 111 filled rooms from behind that desk in a single night, before the dark ended, I could force the total vacancy the house could not survive. But to do it, I had to sit the desk. I had to become the thing the house ate. I had to stop being staff useful, moving on the outside of the doors, spared, and go sit in the one chair that turned a person into the next vacancy. The chair Delgado died in and Sonny died in, and stay in it long enough to check out 111 rooms, knowing that the whole time I sat there, the house would be working to check me in, to make me the desk's next vacancy, the way it always did. That was the cost. Not my life necessarily. But sitting the killing chair with my hand on the register, racing the house to empty itself before it emptied me. Whichever of us finished first. I picked a night near the end of October, when the dark ran longest, because I needed all the dark I could get, and I needed the daylight to come and find the house empty, and hold it empty into the day when the house couldn't reach. I told Odalis I'd cover the desk myself that night. That Sonny's replacement had fallen through and I'd double up, engineer and clerk both. And she was so relieved not to have an empty desk shift that she didn't ask a single question. And I've thought since that there was a bitter joke in it. She'd have done anything to avoid an empty desk, same as the house. And she handed me the register to keep it filled, never knowing I meant to empty everything. I sent Pruitt home. Told him I didn't need security that night, gave him some reason. I didn't want him asleep in the office when it started. I didn't want him to be a person in the building the house could reach for if it couldn't get me fast enough. I wanted the property clear of every living soul, but me. One man, the desk, the register, the master keys, and a full house. I came on at 11. The board read 41%, ordinary, the daytime half-empty box. And I sat down in the desk chair, Delgado's chair, Sonny's chair, and I felt it the moment I sat. Felt the house turn its attention onto the desk the way you feel a room go quiet when someone dangerous walks in. I had become the still point. I had made myself the thing it turned around. And it started to fill. The chime went bing-bong. The counter clicked. A tag came off the board. Then another. The house checking in. Through me now, through the desk, the way it did every night. And I sat there and let it. Because I needed the house full before I could empty it. You can't check out a room that isn't checked in. I had to let it do its work first. So for 3 hours, I sat the desk while the desert coronet filled itself around me. In the dark, hook by hook, chime by chime, the water coming on in room after room. The showers, the warmth, the board going bare. And I did not move, and I did not run, and I kept my hand near the register, and I waited for no vacancy. It came at 2:40 in the morning. The last tag came off the board, every hook bare. 111 rooms full, 112 minus the desk room, mine 112, which had been Delgado's and was mine now. Full, bolted, warm, running water, permanent occupancy, the fullest the coronet had been in 60 years. The fullest maybe it had ever been. And the neon out front, which I could see through the office window. DESRTCROET. Buzzed and flickered, and for the first time all summer, the dead letters caught. All of them, vacancy going dark, and no vacancy burning red and whole over the parking lot for the first time in decades. The house's heart's desire achieved, glowing. And I opened the register and I started checking them out. I'm going to tell you what checking out a full house of the permanently occupied is like. Because I've never said it, and I need to, once out loud, to somebody. It's paperwork. That's the horror of it. It's the most ordinary thing in the world. You take the register, the real one, The old bound book the original owner kept. That Odalis still made the clerks sign because the management company was too cheap to fully go digital and you go down the rooms, and for each occupied room, you write the checkout. Timeout. Zero balance. You take the key back. I had the masters. I used the masters as the keys returned. One master representing every room's key coming back across the counter, and you close the room. Checkout. Vacancy. Real signed official vacancy, made by a real clerk at the real desk, hand on the register. And the house felt it. Oh, it felt it. The first checkout I wrote room 103, timeout 2:41 a.m. And downstairs I heard the water in 103 cut off, and I heard, faint through the whole building, a sound like a held breath letting go. And on the board, a tag appeared on the hook for 103, vacant, checked out, empty. One room emptied. One wound opened in the fullness. And the house turned everything it had on me. The chime started going by itself, bing bong, fast, trying to check in faster than I could check out, trying to refill the vacancy I'd just made. And I heard the front door start to open and close on its own. The counter clicking wild, the house scrambling to fill 103 back up before I could open the next wound. So it became a race. Exactly the race I'd known it would be, me checking out, the house checking in, my pen against its chime, and I bent over that register and I wrote faster. Room 104. Timeout 2:42, water off, tag up, vacant. Room 105. Timeout 2:42, water off, tag up, vacant, and it came at me. Not with a body, it never had a body, that was never what it was. It came at me the way it took Delgado. Through the voice, through the truth, through the desk. Delgado's voice came out of the office intercom, the little PBX handset on the desk, tinny and close. Cassius, what are you doing, man? You're gonna get everybody kicked out. You can't just... And Sonny's voice under it. Honey, stop. You'll lose your job. And other voices, dozens, the 200 a night, all the guests, a rising chorus out of every speaker in the office, the intercom, the radio, the old PA that piped to the pool that hadn't worked in years, all of them saying, stop, don't, let us stay. We're comfortable, we're warm, don't put us out. It's cold out there. Don't make us leave the house, pleading for its occupancy in the voices of everyone it had ever checked in, because an empty room was death to it. And I was writing death into the register one line at a time. Room 1 and 1, oh. Timeout 2:44, vacant. Room 111. Timeout 2:44, vacant. And then it did the thing I'd known it would do. The thing it had done at Delgado's door, the sharpest tool it had. It stopped pleading, and it got true. The voices dropped away, and there was just Delgado, close, right at my ear like he was standing behind the chair. And he said quiet, reasonable, you left me at this desk all summer to save yourself, and now you're going to check me out, erase me so you can feel like you fixed it. That's not fixing it, Cassius. That's just leaving me a third time. First the desk, then the door, now the register. You keep choosing yourself and calling it something noble. And I stopped writing, because it was true. That was the thing about the house. It never lied. That was its whole terrible power. It only ever used the truth. I had left him at the desk. I had not opened the door. And here I was about to write checkout next to room 112. His room, my room, where whatever was left of Delgado was permanent occupancy, and call it a rescue when maybe it was just the final abandonment, the erasing of the evidence, the thing that would let me sleep. I sat there with my pen over the register and Delgado's voice in my ear telling me the truest thing anyone had ever told me. And the chime went bing bong, refilling the rooms behind me faster than I could hold them. and I felt the whole night starting to tip back toward full. Toward the house winning, toward me sitting in that chair, until I became the next vacancy, checked in by the very desk I was trying to empty from. And I want to tell you the thing that let me pick the pen back up, because it's the only wisdom I got out of the whole year, and it cost more than I'll ever be able to say. The house was right that I'd chosen myself twice. It was right that I couldn't undo that. But it was wrong about the third time, and here's how I knew. The first 2 times, choosing myself meant leaving him in. Leaving him at the desk, leaving him behind the door. Both times, the choice that saved me was the choice that kept him occupied, kept him the houses, kept him full and warm and bolted and there. But checking him out wasn't keeping him. Checking him out was the opposite of everything I'd done to him. It was opening the wound instead of leaving it bolted. It was making him vacant, free of the house, checked out, gone, released from a permanent occupancy no soul should be held in. The house wanted me to believe that erasing him and freeing him were the same act, because the house needed him to stay occupied. And it would say anything, even the truth about my cowardice, to keep me from writing that one line. It was using my guilt to keep its rooms full. And I understood, pen over the register, that the guilt was the last bolt. That as long as I believed checking Delgado out was a betrayal, I'd never do it. And the house would keep him and get me too. The only way to free him, the only way to free all of them. Every soul checked into that building against its leaving was to refuse the guilt the house was feeding me and write the line anyway. To choose for once, not myself and not my guilt, but the vacancy, the emptiness, the letting go. I said it out loud, to the voice at my ear, to Delgado, to whatever was left of him, and to the house wearing him. I said, I did leave you, twice, I can't fix that. But I'm not leaving you in, I'm checking you out. You don't have to stay full for me to be forgiven. Go be empty, go be gone. That's the only thing I've got left to give you, and I'm giving it. And I wrote it. Room 112. Timeout 2:52 a.m. 0 balance. Checked out. And the water in 112 cut off, and the voice at my ear stopped. Not cut off, but released. A breath going out and not coming back. And on the board, a tag appeared on the hook for 112. Vacant. And I swear to you, the office got warmer for a second. The way a room does when someone who's been standing behind you finally leaves. And I didn't hear Delgado again. Not that night. Not ever. And I've chosen to believe that's because he was gone in the good way. Checked out, vacant, free, and not in the erased way. And I'll never know. And I've made my peace with never knowing. Because the alternative is madness. And I've had enough of that building's madness to last me. The chime kept fighting. The house wasn't done. It still had rooms full, still had vacancies to fight for. And it checked in behind me while I checked out ahead of it. And the last hour before dawn was the register against the chime, my pen against the door. And I stopped letting myself feel any of it. I just wrote. Room after room. Timeout. 0 balance. Vacant. Faster than I'd ever done anything. My hand cramping, the ink running low. The board filling with tags, one by one, as I opened wound after wound, in the fullness the house could not bear. And here is the thing that beat it. The thing I'd bet the whole night on. The house could refill a vacancy in the dark, but it could only check in through the desk, and I was the desk, and I would not check anyone in. Every bing-bong of the chime tried to make a check-in, but a check-in isn't real without the clerk signing it, without the key across the counter, and I refused to sign a single one. I sat in the clerk's chair, and I did the one thing a clerk can do that the house could not do without me. I declined the reservation. Every time the chime rang, I wrote nothing. No check-in, no key out, no tag off the board. The house could open the door and ring the chime all it wanted. Without my hand on the register, nothing it checked in became occupancy. And meanwhile, I checked out, and checked out, and checked out. By 5:50 in the morning, with the sky going gray at the edge behind the mountains, I wrote the last one. Room 256. The last of the shadow side back rooms, the coldest room in the building, the last full hook on the board. Timeout 5:51. AM, 0 balance. Checked out. And the last shower in the building cut off. And the last tag went up on the board. And every hook on the wall behind the desk had a tag on it. All 112, every room vacant, the whole house checked out. 0 occupancy, total vacancy. The one thing the desert coronet had spent 60 years and untold souls making, certain could never, ever happen. And the neon out front died. Not flickered, died all at once. Des RTC Roette going black over the parking lot, no vacancy gone dark. And the building around me made a sound I have never heard before or since, and cannot describe except to say it was the sound of a held breath finally, fully, letting go. 60 years of held breath, going out of every room at once, out into the desert dark. And then there was nothing. No chime, no water, no voices. Just an old empty motel in the last dark before dawn. 112 empty rooms. A night engineer alone at the desk with a cramped hand, and a register full of checkouts, and the gray light coming up over the mountains. The house was empty. And I held it empty. I sat at that desk, and I did not check in one single thing. And I watched the daylight come up and fill the parking lot. And the day came. And the house could not reach in the day. And by the time the sun was full over the coronet, it was just a building. A dead half-century box on a bad street, empty, quiet, done. I'd forced the vacancy past the dark and into the day. And a thing whose whole nature was fullness, held all the way empty into the daylight, had nothing left to be. It never filled again. I know because Odalis shut it down within the month the management company had been looking for a reason. And a motel that had somehow checked out to 0 occupancy overnight with a register full of impossible entries in the night engineer's hand was reason enough to call it a loss and board it up. They boarded it that November. I got a check and a handshake and no questions I couldn't dodge. And the Desert Coronet Motor Inn sat empty on that street, really empty, honestly empty. A boarded-up box with a dead neon sign, and it stayed empty. And empty is what killed it. And empty is what I'd wish on it forever. So here's the last of it. The closing image, since I've told you everything else true. I drove past the Coronet about a year after it closed. I don't know why. You drive past the places that marked you. Everybody does. It was still standing, still boarded, a demolition notice zip-tied to the fence, the pool still drained, the sign still dead. And I sat in my truck across the street in the daylight and looked at it. An empty building, 112 empty rooms. And I felt the thing I'd been chasing all along, which was nothing, no pull, no dread, just an old dead motel waiting for the wrecking crew. Empty and quiet and done. And then I looked at the sign. The neon, dead DESRTCROET. Half the letters gone for decades. And in the daylight, cold and unlit, I could see the 2 panels below the name, the vacancy panels. The ones that had flickered to life the night the house filled and gone black the night I emptied it. And one of them, I got out of the truck and crossed the street to be sure. And I'm sure one of them still had a bulb intact behind the dusty red glass, one bulb in a dead sign on a boarded building. And it was the panel that read, "Vacancy." And as I stood at the fence in the flat desert daylight, that one bulb, wired to nothing, powered by nothing, in a building with the electric cut off for a year, that one bulb was lit. Dim, steady, just barely. Vacancy, glowing faint in red in broad daylight over an empty boarded motel that would be rubble by spring. I stood there a long time looking at it, and I decided, and I still decide, every time I think about it, that it wasn't a warning, and it wasn't the house not quite dead. I decided it was the opposite. I decided it was the building, finally telling the truth. Vacancy, empty, all the way empty, at last, forever. The one word it had spent 60 years and a dozen night clerks making sure it would never have to show lit up plain in the daylight for anyone driving past to see. Empty. Done. Vacant. I never told anybody why the coronet checked out to 0 the night I worked the desk. The register's gone, demolished with the rest of it, my impossible handwriting and all. Delgado's a walk-off in a management company's file. Sunny, too. And me, I'm just the last night engineer that place ever had, which is the thing I set out to be, back when I decided not to walk off of the last one, so there'd never be a next one for it to eat. If you ever work nights in an old place that runs half empty, and you notice the vacancies filling up in the dark when the computer says they shouldn't if the water runs in rooms nobody rented, if a board fills itself, if a door locks from the wrong side, don't warn the day people, they won't hear it. Don't try to fight the fullness, and don't, whatever you do, open a bolted door because a voice you know asks to be let in. Check them out, all of them. Sit the desk and open the register and make it empty. And hold it empty past the dark into the light, where the thing can't reach. It's the only word those buildings can't survive. Vacant. That's the whole story. I was the night engineer at a Vegas motel, and the doors locked from the outside because the house was filling itself and meant to stay full forever, until somebody finally sat the desk and checked the whole thing out, down to 0, and held it there till morning. The sign says vacancy now, in the daylight, on a dead building, lit by nothing. Let it stay lit.